Well, today's parable makes most people squirm a little bit. Probably all of us at some point in our lives, when we catch ourselves doing that, what the Pharisee did, being complacent and judging everybody else better than they are. Do you notice the phrase in the gospel where it says the Pharisee prayed thus to himself? Exactly. He wasn't praying to God. He was congratulating himself. He was praying to himself. I'm better than everybody else. And as we see in the gospel, and as we see in history, and maybe even in our own lives, as we see today in this country and elsewhere, it's the pious people and the religious people that are usually the most insufferable. The more pious you are, the greater danger is that you fall into this. So it's intolerable sometimes to listen. And why is it so obnoxious? Well, because it's a lie, If it's not sheer hypocrisy, which it often is, there's a whole a lack of awareness of the fact that everything is God's gift. Whatever good works we do, as Paul says, God prepared in advance that we should walk in them and gives us the desire and the ability to accomplish them. Everything is from God. You don't have to try and impress Him. He knows us better than anybody, including ourselves. He knows we're capable of nothing, and He doesn't care. That's the whole point. We're created by Him. We're redeemed by Him. Everything is grace. Everything is God's love. We don't have to earn it. We don't have to gain it. We don't have to merit it because we can't. We don't have to. It's all God's gift. So who are you trying to impress? Maybe other people. Maybe ourselves. If you think about it psychologically, probably what's going on in many cases is that people aren't so sure. They feel fragile, as they should. They feel that they're not worthy, so they have to put on a big face. But for whom? For God? For themselves? For others? It's silly. Because we're creatures, we're imperfect, we're fragile, we're constantly failing, and God takes all that into account. So that's one reason it's false, why it's so obnoxious, because it's a lie. But there's actually a deeper reason that we need to be humble, not just because we're creatures and we're sinners and we're fallible. The deeper reason we need to be humble is that God is. Now, a lot of people say, what do you mean God can't be humble? Well, in fact, God is the only one who's humble. And the rest of us, created in His image, need to plug into that. To be humble as God is. Well, how so? Well, take Jesus Himself, and say, the God-man. What does He say of Himself? Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I am meek and humble of heart. So Jesus Himself, God, is humble. It says He's humble. How so? Well, for one thing, both as God and as man, both, He receives absolutely everything from the Father. His whole being, His whole, whatever He should say, whatever He does, as He says in the Gospel of John, the Son can do nothing of Himself, but only what He sees the Father doing. The Father shares everything with the Son. So the same as we receive totally, absolutely everything, so does Jesus. Everything is a gift. What about the incarnation itself, as Paul says to the Philippians, quoting an ancient hymn? Even though He was in the form of God, He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, snatched. Harpagmos in Greek means booty, something you've robbed. As if, like people want to snatch and grab and keep and claim for themselves, their own righteousness or their own dignity or whatever. But, Paul says, He emptied Himself. And that's because of that was exalted. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted, because the humility is already the exaltation. The pouring out of yourself is already sharing in the divine life, which is what God does. Pouring out Himself in Christ and to Christ. Pouring out Himself in creation from 14.5 billion years ago. Pouring Himself out to us now in Christ and through Christ and in His Spirit. Jesus is the face of God, and he mirrors God's own self-emptying. What could be more humble and more generous and pouring oneself out then to the world, which is what then we need to do. We receive all these gifts to be and to act and to share the divine life and the divine love. We receive it as a total gift, and then because it's a total gift, we're true to it and to God and ourselves by giving as a total gift to others, who, of course, like ourselves, are unworthy, but who cares? Everything we have from creation and redemption is already a gift, so we share it freely as we receive. As Jesus says, as you freely received, freely give. Like God's self, like Jesus himself. That's humility, not holding on to anything. And sharing the divine life, the divine humility. And the other things in the reading today make sense in that perspective. Why do you think, for example, as the first reading says, the prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds? Because it's coming from a place of truth, and it's God's own prayer in that lowly person. It's the Spirit who's praying in and through that person, as Paul says to the Romans. We don't know how to pray as we ought, so the Spirit intercedes for us according to God's will, with groans too deep for words. We can't control or even understand the depth of that prayer, and so it's God imploring God, the Spirit interceding for us by according to God's will. So of course that prayer pierces the clouds. It's God praying to God. It's Christ praying in us and through us as we're transformed more and more into him. Or take the second reading where Paul speaks about himself. Yes, he speaks about receiving a crown and running the good fight, but he knows from long experience that's a pure gift of God. As he says elsewhere, by the grace of God I am what I am, and the grace of God has not been in vain. But he calls himself the worst of sinners, someone born out of season, because he was a persecutor and God had mercy on him anyway. No place for boasting at all. So that's why he goes on to say, God will continue to rescue me and save me from because he knows it's all God's work. It's all that God has been active in him and doing it. And the added nuance that comes from the psalm today, where it says, the lowly will hear and be glad. God is near to the brokenhearted, to those who are crushed in spirit. He saves. For better or worse, in our human lives, it's often great suffering that dethrones our ego finally. So when we really fail, or when we really are bereft, or when we're really suffering, and we experience God's love, then we really, really know in our flesh and our heart that it doesn't come from us. It's just God's work in us and God's life in us, a pure gift. So that's where we need to go with it. There's no temptation to stand and boast about, because nothing is from us. It's all God's gift. And we don't judge other people either. We're no better than they are, they're no better than we are, and we don't have to be. We are just God's beloved children who receive his gifts and share his gifts among ourselves. And if you don't understand anybody else, or their way of being or doing, or even understand yourself, in any case, it's not up to you to make any judgment of others. All you have to do is pour out God's love and generosity and forgiveness and peace and compassion. Receive freely, give freely. So make that your program for not just the week, but for the rest of your life. Be as humble as God.